And we're live. Welcome to the Agiloft webinar series. I'm your host today, Danielle Haugland, Global Alliance Director at Agiloft. I am a former Big Law litigator turned legal tech and contracting enthusiast by way of a very long and windy road. I'm delighted to welcome our guests today, Rohit, Gulati, and Jaime Woltjen. Rohit is a senior director at HBR Consulting and heads up the CLM consulting practice at the firm. And Jaime is a director responsible for legal management strategy and operations. Welcome, Rohit and Jaime. Today, we are talking about trends in contract management operations. HBR recently released its annual law department survey, and it is chock-a-block full of must-see insights. Rohit and Jaime will preview the survey results and then dive into considerations for creating a CLM implementation roadmap, as well as tips for increasing adoption and change management. But before we dig in, let's get some housekeeping out of the way. We are aiming for a 20 to 25 minute discussion followed by questions, which our audience can pose in the Q&A. And we'll do our best to get to everyone's questions within the time that we have, and we'll follow up on any we can't squeeze in today. And today we actually have a special treat. We have incorporated an interactive poll during the presentation, so be prepared to hit your buzzers when the time comes. And I'm really sorry, but there's no prizes available. So Rohit and Jaime, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Danielle. As you mentioned, we have an exciting webinar today. We're going to get interactive with these Zoom polling questions, talk about CLM trends, and building a CLM implementation roadmap. Before we dive in, just a quick overview of HBR Consulting for those of you who may not know us. We are a consulting firm that specializes in the legal industry, serving both the corporate law departments and law firms. We are over 700 individuals strong, and we're continuing to grow. To the right-hand side, we've summarized some of our service offerings. The first three offerings have to do with helping clients with strategic assessments of their legal organizations and teams, and helping clients structure their departments. We help them identify what work should be done in-house versus what work can be outsourced to law firms and other legal service providers, and also find cost-saving opportunities. In the legal technology line of services, we provide clients with services around preparing technology roadmap, selecting systems, implementing systems, and providing ongoing support services. And last but not the least, we have a team of data scientists who help with our clients to help them with their data analytics programs and help them with implementing data analytics and business intelligence type tools. With that intro, Jaime has some interesting findings for us to look at from our most recent surveys. Jaime, over to you.
Thanks, Rohit. So as Rohit mentioned, we'll start by jumping into some trends we're seeing on the technology, people, and process front as it relates to overall legal technology and the more specifically contract lifecycle management before we jump into the specifics of how to build a best-in-class roadmap. So starting at a high level, wanted to provide some insights from our annual law department survey, as well as a series of sounding boards that we've conducted with in-house leaders over the last several months, looking at technology investment overall, so what that looks like across the industry. First, from kind of a strategic planning perspective, so something we always look for and advise in terms of best practice for corporate legal departments is setting out with really a strategic roadmap that defines the overall strategy for investing in legal tech across the board for technology. And what you can see here broken down is the level of detail and maturity that we see companies incorporating in their roadmap. So from fortunately the minority of companies, 19% having no tech roadmap, but looking more from a best practice perspective, looking at 47% having that short-term roadmap in place, and 34% having that long-term detailed roadmap, setting out different types of investments, what that looks like over a multi-year period. So a number of companies really thinking about technology from a strategic lens. And then looking from a budget perspective. So how are our corporate legal departments looking at technology in terms of investments and costs in 2022 compared to 2021? So while the majority here, so 53% are not seeing any significant changes in budget, I think a very encouraging sign for any of our tech savvy departments and those looking to invest more in the tech space. 34% seeing a moderate increase in their technology budget, and 8% a significant increase. Obviously, a lot of this has been driven by and accelerated by the pandemic in terms of working from home and what type of technology tools can we bring into departments to more effectively enable that hybrid or remote working environment. When we look at how this budget is being applied, so what are the key trending technologies we are seeing and that we gathered through our survey data? So we have around 20 different core legal technology tools that we ask about status on, whether it's currently implemented, planning to implement it, are you optimizing tools, are you looking at new tools? And what we've called out here on the left-hand side of the page is specifically what we call our top 10 trending legal technologies. So where we have the highest percentage of departments looking to implement something new over the next several years. So on this list, what we're here to talk about today, contract lifecycle management, nearly 20% of the company saying this is in focus for the next couple years. And then you'll see as well, we have highlighted in the lighter orange here, a number of other related technologies that overall feed into the broader picture of workflow and how we may be managing contracts within the department or within a company more broadly.
Hey, Jamie, can I ask a quick question here?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm noticing that the top 5, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, right? Those could be contained in a single, those functions can be contained in a single tool, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. So when we look at legal service requests, so the intake of work in the department, so workflow, conditionally routing, approvals, things like that, and obviously e-signature, top use cases across all those areas will be contract management is what we see most people exploring. And similarly, when we get into the RFP space, similarities there. And even on the AI front, while we don't dive into specific use cases there, anecdotally, we're seeing more of that being applied to the contract front as well, outside of the more traditional e-discovery space, which it's been predominant within for years.
Gotcha.
Yeah. When we look at over to the right-hand side, so diving a little bit more into contract management technology exists today and what the market is looking at in terms of movement in this space. So across the companies surveyed, 60% of corporate law departments had indicated they do have a contract management system in place today. Obviously, the maturity of those systems, how they're used will vary a lot within that 60%, but looking at, year over year, seeing increases in terms of adoption there. For those that do have the tool in place, we're seeing a lot of movement within that. So 12% of those specifically looking to optimize and invest in what they have. So taking the tool they have today, how can they make it more robust? How can they build out more functionality, improve your user adoption, really focusing on improving what they have. And then 24% as well. They may have had a system in place for a while. Maybe it's something that's been driven through finance, procurement, IT counterpart, and looking at, what are the options out there and what will be the best fit tools for their particular team. So hopefully this provides some context on what we're seeing, legal tech more broadly, and then specifically in the CLM space at a macro level. And with that, we wanted to jump into a few specific questions. We'll flash up a poll here in just a minute to get a pulse of this group. So this first question is one that we get a lot in terms of who owns contract management technology within the organization. So while in many instances, it may be a legal team driving it, in other corporations, it may be a much more procurement, finance-driven tool. So I wanted to get a sense from this group where it sits today, recognizing that probably for a lot of you, it may sit in multiple buckets that we're looking at here. Okay, why don't we go ahead and bring up the results if we can of what we have so far. Okay, so interesting distribution here. Actually encouraged to see more legal than I may have thought. So 58% saying that legal has had some ownership stake in contract management, which is great to see, helping drive those requirements on that side. See, followed by procurement, which we would expect, and smaller minority in the other areas as well. Okay, great. So we have one more polling question that we'd like to get into as well. So as I mentioned before, 60% of companies, law departments are saying that they have a contract management system in place today, but would like to understand within your organization how that technology is being used. So is it simply a document repository for executed agreements, or are you truly using the system to help manage contract obligations, perhaps automatic assembly of templates? Want to get a sense of the functionality that people are able to take advantage of.
I'm really interested to see the response on this one.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and bring up the responses here. Okay, interesting. I think the last one we would certainly expect, so 80% saying document repository. That's typically kind of step one when we talk about contract management, having that storage place for agreements. And then let's see, a number of these kind of following some of the more mature aspects, automated assembly of templates, workflow tool routing, still fairly good adoption across all these areas, though nearly 50%. So good portion of our crowd here today taking advantage of some of the more advanced features. Okay, great. So thanks everyone for that. We'll go through a few more trends. So wanted to talk about contract management, not just from the perspective of technology, but get into some of the people and process components as before we get into specifically developing a roadmap. Some other data we're seeing from our survey here. So specifically digging into the resource structure for how law departments are managing contracts, what that looks like. So vast majority of departments, companies, as you would anticipate, have more of a fragmented network of lawyers, legal resources that are having their hands in different types of contracts to help with the execution of that work. What we are seeing from a best practice perspective, so that middle line there, more and more teams moving towards dedicated legal resources and a center of excellence. So having a centralized team that's really serving as the hub to support contracting needs within the law department, and even oftentimes more broadly within the organization itself to most efficiently handle that work in a consistent manner. And then the last piece, the other resourcing option as well, is looking more on the outsourcing front. So a number of companies who may be on the more kind of leading edge in how they're approaching resourcing, looking at different alternative legal service providers or legal process outsources to actually assist with the contracting process and administration. When we look across all different types of positions that we track in the law department, so contract specialist is a fairly high growth area when we look at non-lawyer professionals and other individuals in that space. So 30% of teams saying they're looking, at increased headcount, specifically on the contract specialist front to help offload some of that work that may be handled by lawyers today. And then as we jump into from a process perspective, so some of this very technology tied and can be facilitated within the tool, but sometimes may be done more manually for those who are not quite there yet. Looking at things that are in place today in terms of kind of from a best practice process perspective, and then what are people planning to either revisit or conduct first time implementations here. So starting at the top, e-signature, obviously an area of growth, particularly through the pandemic where we're seeing almost universal adoption, but a number of different process considerations. So getting together the signature authority matrix, shoring up templates, creating self-service options for the business, a number of different areas that we're seeing from a process perspective, departments tackling as they look to managing contracts more holistically.
Hey, Jamie, I have a question on this slide too. So I can't help but notice that the adoption of these best practices is kind of an inverse of the basic contract maturity model. And I'm really encouraged that companies are starting with low-hanging fruit like e-signature and basic repository, and that was reflected in our polling results as well. But the greatest potential bang for the buck with CLM technology comes with climbing that maturity model, and would love your all's perspective on that.
Yeah, if I may jump in real quick on that one, Danielle. So that's a great observation, by the way. And as clients look at the impact versus effort kind of evaluation of all of the different capabilities in the CLM system and all the work that needs to go into to implement the CLM system, they do find the highest impact in areas where technology can be implemented readily. That tends to be around that e-signature portion, the repository portion, and really helps the clients answer the question, what's in my contract, right? So being able to spend less time searching and retrieving and answering more of the substantive questions that are contained in the contract. But then you're right, as you move up the maturity curve, maturity model, I should say, there are more efficiency gains to be had by automating things like templates and more kind of business-facing aspects of the contracting process, so the intake, the negotiation process, and really setting up some look-back mechanisms, right? So looking back to see what were the SLAs that we agreed to. Are we meeting those SLAs? Are there any opportunities to improve on those SLAs as well? So that continuous improvement loop, that feedback that continues to improve the efficiency of the process is something that organizations should definitely strive for.
Yeah, and I'll also send kudos out to our audience members, because I think a lot of our audience was pretty far up the contract maturity model here, doing self-service options for contracts, intake forms. So hand clap.
Awesome.
So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Rohit, who will lead us through some components of a best practice CLM roadmap.
Thank you, Jamie. So as we look at the CLM roadmap, right, one of the aspects that we typically look at is that of technology. So what is my technology roadmap going to look like? But there are other components of that roadmap, namely the organization. How's my organization going to be impacted by the CLM program in general? How are the processes going to be impacted? And what is the overall change management approach going to look like? So all of those components should really feed into your CLM roadmap. There are 5 components that I'm highlighting here. They all have quite a bit of depth behind them. So bear with me as I talk us through it. So the first one here is the contract type assessment, which is really an important step to creating a CLM roadmap. This is where you're essentially coming up with an inventory of your contract types, but then coming up with a sequence as to what contract types you want to implement first versus what is going to be phase 2, phase 3 of your CLM roadmap. And as you go through that evaluation, there are multiple dimensions that you can look at in order to prioritize your contracts. One of them, the most popular one, is the volume. So what is your volume of contracts today versus what is it going to look like in the future? But then there may be other types of considerations, other dimensions that you could look at. For example, if there are any strategic initiatives that are underway, if you have a procure to pay type of a initiative going on in the organization, or a lead to cash initiative going on, those types of initiatives may drive the priority of some of the contracts to be higher on your roadmap. The other factor we look at is risk. So what is the relative risk associated with a contract, and does that contract then lend itself to automation through technology? And what are the guardrails that you need to set in place for each of those contracts that are considered to be medium or high risk? You have templates that come into play. So what templates are available today? Maybe those are the ones you want to implement first versus those that can be standardized with relative ease. In the future, those could be a close second. So you need to kind of evaluate the effort that's going to go into creating those templates and getting the contracts ready for automation in the CLM system. And then, of course, there are regional variations to be aware of as well. So that's kind of the first bucket there, that of the contract type assessment. The second one is processes, roles, and responsibilities, and then combining that with the contract types that you've assessed. So as you go through an evaluation of the different contract types, you'll start to identify who is actually working on the contract types, where are the requests coming from for those contract types, and you start to essentially create a map of which business units, which business functions are going to be onboarded first into the contract management system versus in a second or a third phase. And as you do that, you can actually layer in the contract type assessment with the process and role analysis. So an example of that is actually shown on the following slide, Jimmy, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you so much. So as an example here, if you're evaluating your contracts based on the ability to standardize on the left here and the risk associated with the contracts at the bottom in the bottom axis. You can see that the contracts with low risk and high ability to standardize, so that's the top left quadrant, those types of contracts could potentially be put in a more of a self-service or a specialist-led type of a process. Whereas the ones that fall to the right-hand side, to the bottom on the opposite spectrum, where you have low ability to standardize, high contractual risk, those are potentially legal-led contract types, right? So, and you can have variations in the middle where legal is providing some level of oversight, and there are specialists that can be drawn upon to help facilitate the contracting process. And to the right is a quick sample of what that could actually end up looking like. So you have your contract type, inventory, and then which of the different processes these particular contract types fall into.
Hey, so Rohit, I have.
Yeah.
Oh,
go ahead.
Sorry. I have one quick question on this couple of slides. Frequent listeners of the program will know that I am a broken record when it comes to people, process, and technology. And this set of slides that you've just gone over highlight the importance of people when developing the process that will ultimately be captured and automated to the greatest extent in the tech design. So can you share a bit on HBR's philosophy and your version of people, process, and technology? I know people like sprinkle in a bit of data in there. So, give us your vision.
Yeah, no, our vision is very, very similar to that. So we do look at people, we look at it in terms of organization and teams, we look at the processes, we look at the technology as well, and like you said, data, and we bring all of those together through our maturity model that helps us understand where an organization is in terms of its development in each one of those categories, and then we help them bridge the gaps, essentially, how to get to best class from where they may be. So, yeah, of course. And then, Jamie, just flipping back to slide 10. Thank you so much. So, as we talk about processes and roles, a couple of the points there, as you start to come up with a process map, you start to define roles and responsibilities that become your baseline for your CLM system. And you also start to get into change management. So now you start to define how the responsibilities are going to change in CLM. The third component here is optimization of resources. I'm going to hand it over to Jamie for a quick overview of what that may look like.
Yeah, so as been mentioned, the importance of people in this equation cannot be understated, and making sure that the processes and technology kind of carry out as envisioned. But a broader component that folks are looking at in terms of really optimizing how contracts are being managed more broadly is who is doing the work within the legal department. And in order to really get a handle on this, work through departments through exercises, what we call essentially a work analysis, to understand the time being spent today, whether it's across different contract types, as you see off to the left here, so the percent of work FTEs allocated to these different types of contracts, as well as looking at from a phase perspective, whether it's helping with obligations management and administration. Is it actually drafting the contracts, chasing down signatures, to try to dissect the work a little more to understand what are the right resources to do the different components of work. So where a lawyer historically may have managed some of this end-to-end in collaboration with the business partner, looking at it from this lens will help you recognize, are there elements that can go to paralegals, contract specialists, other types of resources, so that you're essentially allocating pieces of the contracting portfolio and the work to the right resource at the right price point.
And then just a couple more components back on slide 10. So establishing a technology strategy. This is, what we typically see in a CLM roadmap, where you have a sequencing of functionality that's going to be rolled out. So if you're going with repository first or intake, again, a prioritization exercise there based on the value, the effort associated with each of those implementations. And last, but often the most critical part of this is the governance and change management aspect. By governance, we mean what are the policies that are going to be put in place to support the CLM system? For example, do all of your contracts need to end up in a known repository? What is the team going to look like? Who are the individuals going to manage the CLM operations? Not just the technology, but the ongoing policy, the process, the look back mechanisms. And then from a change management perspective, bringing all of the stakeholders along who are going to be impacted by the CLM implementation, doing some sort of an assessment to figure out who's ready for change, who needs a little bit more guidance, more help along the way, and really focusing your efforts there. And then one point about change management is after you deploy a system, how do you make sure that you're getting the most out of the system in terms of the ROI? So Jimmy, if you wouldn't mind just going down to one of the slides here, thank you. So what we typically see is clients looking at user engagement or user adoption of a system, where we can look at things like who's using the system, are they using it to the expected level? So if there are training opportunities you need to identify, you can do that. If there are opportunities to further enhance certain functionality so it's easier for users to adopt, you can start to get some of those insights through data here. The other piece of this is what features and functionalities you've implemented. Let's say you've implemented an automated intake, but people are circumventing that. You can start to get some of those insights through here and start to address some of those issues. So this type of an engagement monitoring capability is pretty critical from a change management perspective. So that takes us through our slides. There's one more slide in the end.
So just a quick shout out here before we open it up to maybe a minute or two of questions. Appreciated everyone joining us today and being able to share these insights on contract management with you all. HBR is hosting an upcoming webinar Wednesday, March 7th, called Vision 2022, focused on digital transformation to build the law department of the future. And we're having a number of experts from our team share our thoughts on what the future of digital transformation will look like from a workload cycle perspective. So through intake of work in the department, resource optimization, outside counsel selection, to matter resolution and delivery. So we welcome any and all of you to join us for that conversation as well.
Thank you. And we do have a couple of minutes for questions, and we do have a couple of questions. The first of which is, I think it's going back to slide 10, which functions usually onboard first? And I'm assuming onboard to a CLM solution first.
Yeah, that depends on, again, the contract type assessment. So as you look at the contract types that are going to be most suitable for onboarding, as you go through that assessment, you'll be able to identify who is leveraging those contract types for your day-to-day transactions, and those groups would be the ones you would onboard first. So it requires a little bit of this data gathering, but the answer should be you should be able to get to the answer through the data.
And then next, and this might take us just a couple of minutes over, but I think it'll be worth it. We have a question. I'd love to hear how you've seen sourcing and procurement, both sourcing, procurement, and legal best partner together with the CLM solution. It's a question we get a lot, so I would love to hear your take on it.
Yeah, so I'll go first. So from a sourcing procurement perspective, I know that there are procurement systems that are in place that help with things like vendor onboarding and RFP events. Often where we see the interaction between legal and procurement is around how do we get the contract to be part of the procurement process, and how do we make sure that the contract is being executed at the right time with the right terms. So from that perspective, it's a matter of design, and potentially if you're looking at multiple contract management systems, and I'm not sure if that's what this is alluding to, perhaps integrating the systems in a way that legal gets the visibility that they need into the procurement work that's happening, all the deals that are happening, and then vice versa. Procurement is able to get to the templates and the executed copy of contracts in a timely manner.
Yep. Well, we are 1 minute over. So thank you to our panelists today, Rohit, Gulati, and Jaime Woltjen. Thanks to our audience for joining us for another round of the Agiloft webinar series, and we will see you next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.